Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Lewis. I'm the president of KidneyCAN, and we thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. I want to give you a few moments to answer a couple of quick questions. We're doing a poll. We're not going to be releasing this data. We just wanted to find out if there's interest in future town halls and gauge our audience interest on that. While you're doing that, we're going to dive right in. Tonight's topic, I think all of you know, always an option, clinical trials. And we want to thank our sponsors. First of all, there's 140 registrants out there for tonight's event. 29 states were represented and 9 countries. So we're thankful for you taking time out of your busy schedules this evening. Thanks to our sponsors, BMS and CRISPR and ASI, Exelixis, Genentech, and Merck. And we especially thank our 2 expert panelists tonight, Dr. Brian Rini from Vanderbilt and Dr. Elizabeth Plimack from Fox Chase. I'll introduce Dr. Rini. He's a Buckeye from Ohio State University, also was educated at the University of Chicago. He's a professor of medicine at Vanderbilt University, formerly at the Cleveland Clinic, and now the inaugural chief of clinical trials. He's published clinical trials at Vanderbilt, and he's published hundreds of articles. I think also he and Dr. Plimack were involved in the Keynote 426 trial. Thank you, Dr. Rini, for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Brian. It's good to be here.
Great. And also we're pleased to have Dr. Elizabeth Betsy Plimack from Fox Chase Cancer Center. Dr. Plimack started off at NYU and then studied at University of Texas, worked at MD Anderson, is now the deputy director at Fox Chase Cancer Center in Philadelphia. She's also a professor and director of GU clinical research and on the KCRP, or the Kidney Cancer Research Program's programmatic panel. So great. Let me kick it off here. As kidney cancer patients have more treatment options, it becomes especially important to encourage them to think about trials as one of their treatment opportunities. So Dr. Rini, Dr. Plimack, we're going to start talking about the treatment journey. When a new patient just diagnosed with kidney cancer comes to see you for the first time, are you likely to bring up a clinical trial setting? Dr. Plimack, you want to give that one a try?
Yeah, sure. So we think of trials at Fox Chase as, we have a portfolio of trials for our kidney cancer patients. And we really try to select only the trials that we think are the best for the patient, that provide sort of a meaningful promise of activity of a drug or something very early and very exciting. So if a patient comes to me and I have a really good trial in the frontline setting, I will absolutely bring it up. Typically, for the very first visit, we do a lot of talking about sort of, level setting, what the state of the disease is, answering any questions about how they sort of got here, going over whatever prior treatment or workup that they've had, setting the goals of care, whether it's curative or metastatic, and then sort of going through the tools in the toolbox and what we recommend. And usually there's a standard of care option. And often we do have a clinical trial option. And if we do, it will have been vetted through our group. It'll be a good trial and we'll offer it.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Plimack. Dr. Rini, is your institution have a similar process?
Yeah, I think any academic institution, any drug developer, clinical trialists like Betsy and I are, we think of trials for every patient. Now, we don't have a trial necessarily for every patient. Not every patient is eligible. Some patients live 5 hours away. There's all sorts of reasons patients can't go on trial, but I tell my fellows is when they present to me, I want to know what trials are available for that patient. And I think a perhaps common misperception in the patient community is that trials are a quote unquote last resort, that you have to try every standard treatment and then you go to trials, and nothing really could be further from the truth. And I think, Betsy and I do what we do because we think patients benefit from trials, right? And I think we know they do. And so we want to introduce that at every step of the way, understanding again that patients may go on a trial up front and then be treated off protocol and then go on a trial for a third line therapy, et cetera. So we try to keep it in the mix for every patient along the way.
Great, thank you. So we're going to jump in. There might be some of the folks in the audience that are new to this and new to the whole clinical trial landscape. Can you give us a few definitions? Tell us maybe some of the basics around phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and the process. Maybe you could talk a little bit about either informed consent or what documents you share and the ability to work with a nurse or someone else at your institution to get more information. You want to try that one, Dr. Plimack?
Sure. So that's a lot, Brian. I'll try to
Big topic.
that set of questions.
It's for two of you.
Sure. No, I mean, I think when you're presenting a clinical trial to a patient, I like to break it down in terms of, okay, this is the standard of care. This is our clinical trial. This is why we are excited about this clinical trial. We're excited because of the mechanism. Sometimes it's using drugs that are already approved and already used in kidney cancer, but being used together in a new and different way. Sometimes we'll have participated in the phase 1, and we know that there's promise in terms of efficacy, and we're participating now in the phase 3 that we're offering to the patient, and we can cite that. So I usually break it down between the knowns and the unknowns of a clinical trial. There's always something that's unknown. There's always a question that we're asking when we design a clinical trial and offer it to patients. And I think I want to be clear with the patient about what we don't know, but also clear about where we think the promise lies. So I think Brian and I both really believe in trials. We've seen so many patients benefit from them, get access to drugs we use now routinely many years before they were widely available. And so that's how I approach sort of the concept of clinical trials.
Dr. Rini, you want to add some to that big long
Yeah,
list?
sure. I guess just to touch on the phase question, I think historically, phase 1 would figure out the dose of the drug. Phase 2 would try to see if there's any initial signal of efficacy, like a response rate. And then phase 3 was a big randomized trial against standard of care. Those are the traditional phases. I will say in the last at least 10 years, those lines have become very blurred. And we've seen drugs approved off earlier stage trials, or now there's very commonly phase 1/2 trials. So the lines have gotten very blurred. But in general, early in development is finding the dose and safety and making sure it's doing something. And then later in development is what we call registration intent, right? With the intent of filing with the FDA. So a big, large 800 to 1,000 patient randomized trial. And then maybe the only other part I'll add that you touched on was informed consent. So every single trial has to be approved by an institutional review board, an IRB. That process involves a consent that are often many, many pages, I think many pages longer than they need to be, but are meant to be a fairly simple lay language explanation of what are we doing to the patients? How often are you here? What's the drug? What are the potential side effects? I always warn people, I think I've seen some consents that are 30 and 40 pages, which I think is just too long. I think in an attempt to explain things, we make it a little overly complicated, but that's an editorial on the side. I mean, I think the idea is that, you will have to sign a consent saying, I understand what I'm about to go through, including those uncertainties like Betsy alluded to before participating.
Yeah, just to sort of add to what Brian discussed, a consent is just that. As he said, you're signing a document saying, I understand. You're not promising to take a drug or to be in a study or for any length of time. You're just documenting that you and I have had this conversation and you understand. Now, I usually chuckle when I say that because I'm handing them, as Brian said, a 20 or 30 page document and asking them to sign something they haven't read, saying they understand based on a conversation. So usually we do it as a 2-part process where we say it's really important that you understand all the potential risks and benefits of this study. I'll explain it to you. If you're interested, sign here so we can get the ball rolling, but take it home over a cup of coffee, read it thoroughly, make notes in your notepad, and call my protocol nurse the next morning with any questions you have, because we really want to be sure that you've read it, that you understand, and that you still want to participate after thinking about it. And that 2-step process seems to work to really sort of get an understanding going. Some trials are really complicated, even for us as doctors and investigators, and some are more straightforward, but it's our job to explain, all types of trials to the patient so that they understand. And then it's a little bit of a leap of faith and we're in it together.
I
just wanted to add one thing that Betsy touched on. I always tell people, you're not signing up for the Army here, right? So if you sign up and even if we start treatment and then 2 weeks in, you decide it's not for you, that's okay. I mean, we don't want people to sign up with the intent of withdrawing consent, as we'd say 2 weeks later. But, we're not holding people down and giving them drugs, right? You give your consent every day, right? Every day you take treatment, every day you walk in to get an infusion. It's in essence ongoing consent. It's not you have to decide for the rest of your life sort of thing.
And it's absolutely voluntary. Participation, as Brian said, at any point in time is voluntary.
Great. All right. Let's see. Next question we had is, are there specific benefits to a patient that you might be telling them that they might not otherwise have on a clinical trial?
I can take that one first. So usually what I tell patients is, listen, the good parts about going on a trial are you're getting very likely access to treatment that you couldn't otherwise get, right? An investigational drug, an investigational combination, et cetera. That's really the reason you do it. In kidney cancer, we're fortunate to have, 14, 15 FDA approved drugs. So there is standard of care for pretty much every patient, but you're getting access to, a new drug, a new mechanism, a new whatever that we might not otherwise have access to. And this could be a good thing and a bad thing. Usually there's a greater intensity of visits and scans and labs. Now some people like that, but that's also on the negative side. Trials are more of a hassle than standard of care. They just are. You got to be in the building more often and go through more tests and get poked more and get more blood drawn and probably get more frequent scans. It's just the way trials are, usually with good reason, for safety, and for a lot of the important reasons. But that's the downside is I can't just hand you the drugs and have you, drive to your home 4 hours away and then come back 3 months later for a scan. That's not the way it works. So try to explain the sort of the good side and the bad side to patients.
Yeah, I agree. Just to add to that, I usually use the analogy, like I have a toolbox, I have a certain set of tools in there. And if a trial comes along, that adds something to what I have to offer. And so usually you can always go to the next thing that, the standard of care offering that you're offering in addition to the trial, that's always going to be available to you for the most part. And the trial sort of offers something extra, something we can try that can add to the list of things that we have available. And the other thing I'll add is that you get extra TLC with all those extra visits. You have a research nurse who you can contact with questions. It's your first point of contact. Your symptoms are really sort of thoroughly evaluated at each visit and documented. You just get extra hands-on approach. It's almost like a concierge service. So while that's not a reason to choose a clinical trial, I think it's a benefit that for most patients offsets those extra visits and blood draws that Brian mentioned.
Okay, the question was asked earlier to both of you. For a patient who has never had treatment, can a trial make sense as a first-line treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it makes sense sometimes before surgery. It's called neoadjuvant, after surgery, adjuvant, frontline, second. It potentially makes sense with every therapeutic decision. And so again, when I'm quizzing my fellows and I say, okay, what are the options for this patient? If they don't say clinical trial, it's sort of the easy answer. I say, you can always give that answer, right? It's always an option. Now, again, we may or may not have a trial, the patient may or may not be eligible, et cetera, but we need to think about those options. So, and I would encourage, patients out there to ask, are there trial options, in my circumstance?
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
I love when patients ask that, right?
Yeah.
Like that's, I love when they're invested or they know about a trial or they come to me with trials, et cetera. That makes my job a whole lot easier.
On that note, for the newer person here in the audience, can you define for me an end point, and also Dr. Rini, maybe just adjuvant real quick, or neoadjuvant together?
Sure, I'll do adjuvant, neoadjuvant, but so you can do endpoint.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I'll start with adjuvant. So adjuvant just means after surgery. So it means, in lay language, we cut everything out we could see, but we know that even the best surgeons at the best hospitals, there's still a chance that the cancer comes back. So we're going to give you this therapy to try and reduce that chance. It's a long-winded way of saying adjuvant, right? After surgery. Neoadjuvant is just, I don't even know where the term came from, but it's before surgery. Those are really very different trials, sometimes meant to shrink tumor to make surgery more possible. It gets fairly complex. In kidney cancer, there's no standard neoadjuvant therapy. Both Betsy and I together and separately have done neoadjuvant trials. It's probably a whole separate discussion. There's more adjuvant trials and therapy now in kidney cancer, but those are the definitions.
Great. Thank you. And Dr. Plimack, endpoint?
Yeah. Sure. So endpoint is really a technical term that is part of the design of a trial. At a patient level, our endpoint is benefit. We want the trial treatment to benefit the patient. In a clinical trial, however, where we're treating hundreds, sometimes more, thousands of patients, you have to set a bar for what is success. And that is what the endpoint of the trial is. So one example, Brian just talked about adjuvant. You can see if the treatment delays recurrence or if it cures more people. Those are different endpoints. Both are important. We hope to see both. But how a trial is designed and whether it's initially and then subsequently considered successful is based on the endpoint. Sometimes when the endpoint is met, there's a big cheer, there's a big presentation, and this immediately becomes standard of care because the endpoint was a very relevant one for patient care. Other times a trial can meet its endpoint, but ultimately not be clinically useful because the endpoint itself wasn't meaningful. So that's a long way of saying that this is how the science of clinical trials is evaluated once the data are collected. Each patient participating in a trial participates in sort of donating their information, their time and their experience to the larger collective knowledge of how that drug works. And then we take that knowledge and parlay it forward to future patients in new standards of care. And Brian and I are so lucky to be kidney cancer the last 10 and 15 years because we've had so many positive trials and so many trials that have changed what we do for the better, such that we're constantly kind of shuffling around how we do things because of that progress.
And one of the questions that was asked by the audience that was already answered is, can a patient remove him or herself from a trial once it begins? And I think that's an overwhelming yes answer, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, so not only is it a yes answer, but the trials are designed with safety in mind. So if there's new information that comes about a trial that makes it unsafe for a patient to continue, we will recommend that the patient stop or offer for the patient to stop. Other things that can happen is sometimes you have a randomized trial where you have a control arm with people getting standard treatment and a treatment arm with people getting investigational treatment. When we learn that the treatment arm is superior, for instance, the investigational arm is superior, we unblind if patients are blinded and we offer patients in the control arm access to the subsequent treatment. And that's just sort of ethical, right? If we learn that what we're doing actually works, we bring that to the patient in real time.
Got it. We're getting close to a couple more questions, and then we're going to bring some audience members up. Are new patients who've never had a treatment surprised that a trial is one of their offerings?
I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe sometimes. I don't know, Betsy, what you think. I mean, people have all sorts of different experience heading in and knowledge base. So I don't know if surprised is the right word, but
okay.
I don't think so anymore. I mean, I think we've shown that early phase trials can be really successful. I think, a lot of your patients who are on right now and smart patients, patient networks share good experiences from trials. So I think it's the opposite. I think people come to us, as Brian said, saying, what do you have that's new? What do you have that's in trials? I don't think they're surprised.
Okay. And then just to dive in a little bit to the informed consent that you were discussing and the sort of agreement, you have someone that that patients can talk to about questions around that, or do they come back to you, or is it a combination?
It's a combination. So I usually will hand a patient a consent, say, take this home, read it over, line up a bunch of questions in an email. If there's a few, I'll type a response. If there's 42 of them, I'll just pick up the phone and call them. I also have research nurses and coordinators like we all do they're more a source of how often do I have to be there and what's involved and where do I go and, kind of the nuts and bolts organizational operational aspect. I feel like for the trial questions about, does this drug make sense? Or, the big picture disease and trial questions, I feel like I should answer those. So each patient's different. Some like to email, some like to call, some like to come back and have an in-person visit. So it just depends.
And if you need to send them somewhere else for additional information, do you have certain resources, or is that usually information that you all have access to provide?
Other information about one particular
just
trial?
Like if someone is considering the trial and they want to know maybe some nuts and bolts about the number of times they have to go, or what the infusion actually is.
It should be in the consent. It should all be in the consent. How often do I have to be? And a lot of consents now have either calendars or week 1, you're doing these 5 things. Week 2, you're doing these 8 things. I mean, they really, IRBs are pretty particular about spelling that out for patients. The informed consent is really the best document for that.
Got it. Well, I'm going to see if we can bring up our first audience member who's got a question for you. Let me see if, just pull up my screen here. Izzy, do you know if we can bring up our first question?
Yep, just come in.
Great. I think we've got Carolyn from Maine. We do. All the way from the great state of Maine.
That's right. And it's quite hot here. First of all, thank you, Brian, both Brians, and Dr. Plimack for all that you do for all of us. It's really wonderful to have you here in addition to all that you're doing, helping patients that you're actually treating. I wanted to know, are there trials for patients who've not shown signs of metastases after their nephrectomy?
Yeah, so that would be adjuvant that I mentioned, and there are adjuvant trials with immune therapy ongoing. You may know pembrolizumab is approved in that setting. There are other trials. Most of them have finished. I'm not sure there's any ongoing, but actually there's about to be probably another wave of trials in that setting. Now, most of those you have to start the trial within, at most like 3 months of surgery. So if you're a year out from surgery, you wouldn't be allowed in an adjuvant trial. It's just too far out.
Great.
Thank you.
Dr. Plimack, did you have anything to add to that, or
No, absolutely. I mean, we are about to open another adjuvant trial here. I think adjuvant trials should probably now all include a treatment, whether it's on the control arm or the randomized arm. They are usually randomized, and usually they entail a year, sometimes more, of treatment. Because again, there's nothing to measure or follow to know if the treatment's working. It's again given, and we learn at the end of the trial whether it benefited folks. But it's hard to know individually if they benefit people. We still really encourage people to enroll in adjuvant trials. We're always looking to cure more people, and that's the way we hope to do it someday.
Thank you, Carolyn, for the
Thank
question. One follow-up to that was, do adjuvant trials need to be coordinated before surgery?
Not necessarily, although it's helpful. Again, there's a window after surgery, usually 10 or 12 weeks after surgery. So, I mean, I'll often see patients who are a month out from surgery, seeing their surgeon, and then we'll talk about an adjuvant trial, and there's still plenty of time to get them on trial. The other, I guess, piece is sometimes you don't really know whether a patient will qualify because you don't have their pathology report before surgery, and there'll be certain requirements. You have to be at a high enough risk for recurrence generally to qualify for an adjuvant trial for various reasons we can talk about. So you really don't, you might know that a little bit based on CT scans, but you don't really know it till after surgery.
Okay, great. I'm just trying to see, this question I think might go back a little bit. It was asked, do patients ask you about data and early clinical data or preclinical data as they're trying to make their decisions?
I would say sometimes, but usually we offer it. If we know how the drug performed in phase 1 or phase 2, for instance, I usually bring it up, whether, for a patient with really granular questions, I would bring up the specifics, but even more generally, we've tested this in phase 1 and it's really promising. It's worked for a lot of folks, or to give response rates specifically for someone who's interested. But that's part of the consent process, is what we know and what we don't know about the trial intervention.
I would just add, sometimes, let's say we're doing a part of a global 1,000-patient trial and there's been 100 patients on. Patients will say, well, gee, how are those first 100 patients doing? Which of course we don't know. It's not known till the end of the trial. And frankly, we can't really talk about how other patients on the trial are doing at our center.
Right.
Number one, it might just be a handful out of the 1,000 patients. Number two, it's actually against the law, the SEC. If you traded stock based on that information, right, the SEC would be knocking on your door. So it's not that we don't want to tell you, or, sometimes we just don't know, or frankly just can't.
However, the caveat to that is if there's a big safety problem or a safety signal
sure.
or an issue with the study, we are obligated to tell you in real time, and we do.
Got it. That's an insight I didn't know about. That's great to know. I had a question that came in from one of our audience members, a good friend from Canada, Deb Maskins. She asked, we saw the press release from Cosmic 313 celebrating that it met its endpoint of PFS, progression-free survival. Can you comment on this?
Oh, Brian, you take that one.
It's a complicated question, so I'll do it as briefly as I can. So Cosmic 313, so Ipi-Nivo, as you may know, these two immune drugs are a standard of care. Cosmic 313 was testing that combination versus the same combination plus cabozantinib, so plus another standard drug in kidney cancer. So 3 drugs versus 2 drugs. And it showed a progression-free survival advantage. So the amount of time patients who got 3 drugs disease was controlled was longer than the time on 2 drugs. This wasn't a real surprise because there's another regimen of cabozantinib and nivolumab that would also have sort of beaten ipi-nivo on that endpoint. What we don't know, or actually what the press release said, is that as of this time of this analysis, we don't know that the 3 drugs make patients live longer. So it did not meet that significance at the first look. It may later on, it may not. And again, all we know is a press release. So the company has to issue a press release for data if it's felt to materially affect their stock. That's the law. So some companies put more data in some, and some companies put less. This was sort of in the middle. So there was a little bit of data, but I would say the jury's very much still out on whether that will become a standard of care. We don't know anything about toxicity, which could be substantial. We don't know what makes people live longer. There are probably other ways to extend this PFS without using 3 drugs. So the data should come out at a meeting in September, a European meeting, almost certainly. So what is that, 2 months or something? So once we have the full data, the full presentation, and presumably a manuscript, we'll know a whole lot more. But you can bet this is going to be a debated area for that trial for a ways to come.
And I'll just add one reason for the debate is that whenever you use 2 drugs, or in this case, 3 drugs together, when you would normally use them in sequence, for instance, ipi and nivo followed by cabozantinib versus all 3 together, you can imagine that you might get the same amount of time overall. But in general, it's better to do it in sequence where you're only exposed to toxicity of one and then the other than all 3 at once for the entire time period. So that's a theoretical concern, but it's one of the reasons Brian and I really want to see an overall survival signal before we decide that this is better in the long run for patients.
Overall survival being OS.
Being how long folks live. If you really are improving, materially, 3 drugs are better than 2 and followed by 1, then you should see that in terms of folks living longer.
Got it.
Right.
Another.
Do you disagree, Brian?
No, I was about to sneeze, so I just.
Oh, okay.
bless you in advance. Just a couple of topics came up there: safety signals and toxicity and adverse events. Mm-hmm. Can you just give us some quick definitions?
Oh boy. I guess they're kind of all the same.
Yeah, like how badly are we making patients feel, right? It's tricky to measure. It's very hard. Of course, you're willing to feel a little bit poorly if something's working really well. It's definitely not worth it for a drug that's not working at all. But toxicity is, sort of a side effect. An adverse event is a bad effect. And safety means, we want to make sure drugs are safe and don't cause permanent harm.
They're all just kind of trial terms for side effects.
Yeah.
And they mean a little bit different things, but they're all in the bucket of side effects.
Got it. And my understanding is there's different grades of the side effects and different numbers assigned to those. Can you just give a brief touch on that?
Yeah, it's not really brief. So the National Cancer Institute came out with this grading system, I guess years ago. It's been updated many times. And it's really meant to level the playing field. So when I report one trial and Betsy reports another, it's kind of apples to apples comparison of how bad was the nausea and how bad was the diarrhea. So it's a grading system, a higher numbers worse of how bad is the side effect, basically in categories: mild, moderate, severe, and life-threatening from 1 through 5. Mild, moderate, severe, life-threatening.
Grades 1 through 5.
Grade 5 is death.
That is death.
Side effect. So yeah, I guess there's 5. So yeah, I don't know from a patient standpoint, knowing much about grading is helpful. Like it's something that's what we do in clinic, and we grade toxicity, side effects, and the research nurses help us. I mean, it's a lot of what we do. I think, frankly, there's probably too much of that. We should focus on more important side effects that are higher grade or important to patients, because we waste a lot of time with low grade side effects that probably don't matter. But again, it's a different conversation. Got
it. All right, we're going to shift a little bit of gear here. We've got a couple of questions around community oncology. So I know you both are at large centers, so maybe you can give some insights on this. The question was, do the community oncologists often refer a patient to your clinic for the trial discussion, or are most of your first line patients those who come to your institution for care?
It's really both. Some people, we're the first docs they see, and we talk about trials, and they're in our system and they go on trials or not. Sometimes, kidney cancer is a fairly rare disease. So the advantage that Betsy and I have is, a community oncologist may just see a handful of patients a year. And so they say, gee, I don't have trials, I don't have the expertise. You should go see, so-and-so at this academic center. Unlike, say, a breast or a lung or a colon, the more common cancers. Sometimes they treat them for a while and then they say, I'm running out of options. Why don't you go explore trials? So at least at the centers that I've been at, it's a bit all over the map.
Any different at Fox Chase?
No, exactly the same. I mean, I think we like to encourage referrals at an inflection point in their care, either when they're starting or when there's a recommendation to change therapies. I think that's where we can be most helpful in terms of recommending even standard of care options. And that's where we could introduce a clinical trial if we have one. And our relationship with the community, I mean, Brian and I both work in areas where our patients can come from very far away. If something can be given as standard of care locally, that's better and easier for the patients. But if there's something really we have expertise in here or a trial we only have access to here, then that's something that might be worth them traveling for. It's worth saying, I think we touched upon it, that trials are a center, sort of center specific. So the trials I have are different than the ones Brian has. And so sometimes if there's a trial nearby at another center, I'll refer a patient there and vice versa.
Got it. Last question before we bring up another audience member. This question was, is it hard for a patient who wants a second opinion after talking to a community oncologist? Is it hard to arrange that, to get that second opinion?
Yeah.
And then would you include trials as an option in a second opinion visit?
Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
the answer to the second one is an emphatic yes. I mean, that's our job, right, is to include trials in that second opinion. And it shouldn't be hard. It's probably harder than maybe Betsy and I appreciate, but like, just email me, we'll see you. Like, we want to see patients. That's what we do for a living, but you also have to have the knowledge base and the resources to find, well, who are the experts in kidney cancer and where are they and how close am I? And do I have the resources to get there? So it is, if somebody wants to see me, I'll see any patient anytime, but physically getting there and having those resources and knowing where to go takes time.
Great. All right. I think we've got Anthony from Georgia standing by to ask a question. Let's see, Anthony, I think you're up.
Yes. Thanks for having me. My name's Anthony Settle. I'm from North Atlanta, Georgia. And the question I have is, if I have to travel for a trial, how is that coordinated along with my local oncology care?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as I think Betsy alluded to, trials, like, we can't export trials. So the drugs have to be given in the building. We have to see you for certain reasons, what I call them regulatory reasons, just the rules of the trial, the rules of trial conduct. I always tell people it's really great to have a local oncologist, because sometimes you're not feeling well and need to be seen quickly and you don't want to drive 4 hours to see me, right? So you can go see a local oncologist, or maybe you need labs drawn or something, so it is good to have local care. And usually that's pretty well coordinated, meaning there's communication back and forth between myself, my study team, and the local team. But, and this is sort of just one of those unfortunate realities. A lot of it, and this is part of the hassle of trials, you do have to travel to get drugs and see my team every X number of weeks. And there's really no way around changing that. In a utopian world, it wouldn't be like that, but I don't see it changing anytime soon.
So there was a question, I think, does telehealth change that? And there are some, I am seeing more, not a lot, but some more trials that have, for instance, if it's just checking your labs and symptoms, and vital signs, which you can check at home, that is something we could do with a Zoom visit and a home health visit. And more studies are building that in, I think, to make it easier for patients. But typically, we do have to examine you. We have to look at your hands and feet to see if you have hand-foot syndrome. We have to, really sort of see you. I think also those conversations are a little bit easier and better in clinic. We get a better sense. And a lot of the time, you're getting blood drawn for the study, especially, or you're getting an infusion or a treatment that has to be given at the center. So usually the visits do have good reasoning behind them. And the ones that are able to be converted, I think more and more we'll see those be allowed to be tele or remote.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's come out of this COVID pandemic. So that's encouraging. Thank you very much, Anthony, for your question.
My only caveat to that is, we used to be able to practice more across state lines with telehealth, but at least in Tennessee, I can only do telehealth with patients who are physically in Tennessee. Now, you can actually drive across the state line to Tennessee and I can see you, which is silly. But if you drive back into Georgia, then I'm not by law allowed to see you. So these are really silly, archaic rules around state licensure. I mean, practicing medicine in Tennessee or Pennsylvania is no different, I guarantee you.
Well, it's a little different here because we're tri-state, so we're so close to each other that there's a little bit of
but
flexibility, but it is an issue.
If somebody's in California, say we can't do that for either of us. But, so anyway. Okay.
Well, I think that's one of the issues that I know that we're taking up on the advocacy front, the extension of telehealth benefits, but that's for another day. I think we've got someone, Michael from Canada standing by. Michael, are you there? Yes.
I am. Thank you all for doing this. It's so important. And I obviously want to be able to tell my kids that I've done everything possible. So my question is, can Canadian patients access US trials, clinical trials, if there's no Canadian site?
Yeah, I think it would just be a travel issue. I know when I was in Cleveland, which is much closer to Canada than Tennessee, I've had a periodic patient or two. It's really a matter of, insurance, right? The hospital, because so many things are billed standard of care, even on a trial. Many of the doctor visits, lab scans are billed to insurance and not the trial. So I think it's possible. It's definitely an extra layer of logistics, but there's actually an excellent RCC trial network in Canada. I'm not sure what city you're in, but there's some great RCC docs in Canada in the major cities, certainly. And they have trials, I'm sure.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks, Michael. Appreciate that. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, and can you talk a little bit about drug exclusion criteria and why prior treatments affect which trials a patient is eligible for?
That's
easy. I mean, we're chuckling because Brian and I are constantly, I think, advocating for not using, counting the number of prior trials as something for eligibility, but really focusing more on the health and safety of the patient and whether it's a good fit for the trial. But that being said, for drug development, you sort of set yourself up for a certain line of therapy. And so that's where I think the business of drug development comes in. They want to set themselves up for an earlier line. And so they're testing their drugs in earlier and earlier lines. I think it's our job as, really we're care providers for our patients to make sure we advocate for access to trials when it's medically and scientifically appropriate, and to, continue to have trials for patients regardless of number of prior therapies. But that's a sticky subject. I think we limit it too much personally.
I would just add, broadly, if the question was around exclusion criteria in general, a lot of them are designed for safety. You have to have certain lab values, certain this, certain that. They're probably more than there needs to be. I think that's what Betsy's getting at, is they're more restrictive than they probably should be. And some of them are well-intended, but poorly executed, and we would argue against some of them. But they are what they are. Sometimes we can influence their writing. Obviously, if it's our trial, we write them. If it's a big industry sponsored trial, we might be able to influence them, but often not. And so it's just kind of the rules of the game.
Great. Just a question going back a little bit to the travel required. So could you just give me maybe a sort of a standard? Patients are expected to return so often to the clinic. Can you talk about that a little bit, just so that people get their minds around, if I'm going on to a trial, what do I have to look for in terms of calendaring?
I think it varies trial specific. And usually the earlier the phase of the trial, the less that's known about the drug, the more frequent the visits to both test your blood for certain levels of the drug, but also to check on you. So it's really for your own benefit that the early phase trials have a lot of visits. I would say, I'm going to throw out there, like once a month is a pretty typical sort of time frame for visits for people on trial. And then of course the scans are also set up in there, and you may have to come a day before for that or other testing.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to add, I mean, usually every 3 or 4 weeks, the really early phase trial, it might be weekly or so. Some drugs are given every 2 weeks. There are often sometimes resources within the trial to pay for things like travel and hotel rooms, especially for those very frequent visits. So you should ask about it. I mean, they should tell you, but you should ask. And/or hospitals just have affiliations that might make, hotel rooms cheaper, but it's a real issue, right? Especially with gas prices, right? I mean, it's a real issue. And that's, again, it's just part of the cost of doing the trial is the time and expense of getting back and forth.
Just on that note, because we hear quite a bit about the out-of-pocket expenses that people incur when they're part of a trial. Some are reimbursed, some are not. Is there any leadership around that about trying to change that landscape to make it maybe more required as part of a trial?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know a way to make it required. I don't know a way to, I think the pharmaceutical industry realizes, boy, if we're making patients come a lot, this is going to be a barrier. And so in the whole grand scheme of cost, it's a relatively minor cost to pay for that. Having said that, I'm thinking about all our kidney cancer trials. It's the minority which do provide that, type of reimbursement or stipend. And frankly, even if they do, it's not an overwhelming amount. Like it's $25 for parking, and you know what I mean? It's sort of little bits. It's not, I don't think they're paying gas money or things like that. So but I don't know a way to force that. I mean, it's probably a discussion we could have offline from an advocacy standpoint.
Yeah, I think I would say we should always ask. You should always ask if the cost of travel is a barrier for you. You should always ask your study team. We've asked sponsors for things to make things easier for patients, and often they're willing to, whether it's sort of written into the trial or something that they can do to help.
Got it. Great. All right. I think we have another question coming in from William in Texas. William, are you there? Yes, he is. Kirk. William.
Here I am. Yes. Thank you all for doing this. I appreciate it. My question is, I'm currently on exenatib and pembrolizumab as first-line treatment. How would I find a trial, or how would I find trial possibilities if I need a second line of treatment?
I mean, it just depends on the timing. Hopefully that's never, by the way, but
Hopefully that's never.
Trials come and go. And so, when I'm approached with a patient and making a decision, I pick whatever I think is the best treatment / trial for that patient. And because I don't know when that next decision point is going to be, right? So it might be 6 months, it might be 2 years, it might be never, hopefully, right?
Right.
So you could look for trials now, but if that point is in 6 months, all those trials change over. Certainly within a center, our menu, every 6 or 12 months is probably entirely new. So it's hard to look too early, because even if you find a trial, it's going to change. It might be gone in a month. So
Right.
it's really hard to do now.
And as Brian said, hopefully that's not a question you need to ask ever or many years down the road, in which case we're going to be busy inventing new treatments to be available and new trials.
Cool. Yes. Great. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, William. We're shifting gears here a little bit. It's a little bit more somber topic, but so when both TKI and IO treatments have failed and they're another later line, if patients and community practices first ask about trials after progressing on several treatments, are there novel options out there, or how do patients make their interest known at this stage?
I mean, making your interest known. I mean, I've been sent a lot of patients where they were cared for perfectly well with a community oncologist. And it was really because the patient said, hey, I want to explore trials, is that they were sent over. Sometimes it's patient driven or physician driven or both. So you should always ask about trials at every step. Just like Betsy and I said, we always think about it at every step, but that's not true of every doc out there. At academic centers, it should be, but in the community, perhaps not. I don't know if I answered the question or not.
Yeah, no, I think that touched on it. I think we're trying to figure out, part of this is how do we help the community practices learn more, or the patients that are going to the community practices learn more about clinical trials if they're not learning it at that level.
Yeah, just ask, and say, I want to go talk to somebody. Ask, and if you're not getting the answer you want, then through KidneyCAN or other advocacy organizations, figure out where the closest place is.
Great. Let's see. I think we have a question coming in from, might be either any, I believe is Nebraska, right? Is it Stephanie from Nebraska coming up?
Yep, Nebraska.
Hi, Stephanie. Nice to see you.
Hi. Thank you guys, first of all, for having me, and thanks for answering my question. As a patient and currently in a trial, my question is, are there options for other clinical trials if the first line treatment or current trial ends due to progression?
Yeah, absolutely. At every, I hope Brian and I are emphasizing at every inflection point in your care, when it's time to think of something different, that's the time to ask about a trial. Either if you're at a center that has them, or you can ask your doctor to reach out to the kidney cancer network of doctors, or be plugged into a specialist at a specialized center. But yeah, at every stage. And I think we try to always improve the treatment options available at every stage. And we try to always have a trial open at every stage.
Great.
It gets a little trickier sometimes if patients come off a treatment for toxicity, not because of progression, but because of side effect. Sometimes there are restrictions, like the prior trial may not allow that. It kind of depends. That's where I thought you were going with the question, but so sometimes that situation, they want all toxicity resolved to a certain level, and that's a little more nuanced. But if a prior treatment just stopped working, then that's as straightforward as it gets for the next trial.
And I don't know if this is part of your question, Stephanie, but being on a trial doesn't rule you out of being in other trials. So you can certainly, I have patients who every treatment stage has been a clinical trial option. So I think, as Brian said, your doctor will pick what's the best thing for you. They did, that's what you're on. And then at the next inflection point, they'll do the same.
Okay, thank you.
Good luck.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Shifting gears to non-clear cell kidney cancer, are there trials for non-clear cell cases, and how can patients learn about them?
Yeah, they're, non-clear cell is of course, more rare than clear cell. And so correspondingly, the trials are more rare as well. I think the kidney cancer community, broadly speaking, has done a much better job of conducting trials in non-clear cell in, say, the last, 5 years. But they're still more rare, harder to find, smaller, because it's a rare subset. So they're out there and they should be at major academic centers. But I think it's still a challenge, even though I think it's gotten a little easier.
So Dr. Plimack, when people are searching for non-clear cell trials, do they go to clinicaltrials.gov or go over to their physicians, both?
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before this in the chat, but I think it's just so hard for a patient or even a doctor to use any of these databases to find clinical trials because they open, they close. Some say they're open, but they're not really open. And really your best conduit is your doctor, and ideally a link to a kidney cancer specialist at a specialized site who can tell you. So for instance, we're about to open a clinical trial of tivozanib and nivolumab. And I know, the other sites that have that open, if they get it open before us, I'll be able to refer them there. We do share it with our community oncology network, but they treat every kind of cancer, and it's kind of impossible for them to keep track of what we have at any given time. So I think we are actually the best source of what we have at our sites. And sometimes we'll send emails around, Brian and I send emails to our colleagues saying, do you have a trial for this patient? They're willing to travel. And occasionally we find trials that way. But I think our network tapping into that is probably the best, especially for something like non-clear cell, which is less common.
Yeah, I would just reinforce, finding a trial on clinicaltrials.gov is super challenging. Like, I think I'd have a hard time doing it.
I couldn't do it.
Is what I do for a living. number one, you're only required to update the information every 6 months. So a trial could have closed, 5.9 months ago, and it'll say open. So and the eligibility is not the whole list. And it's, it's one of those things that's good in theory, but in practice, I don't know that it's great, honestly. So like Betsy said, if you can find your way to someone with knowledge, i.e. at an academic center, they're going to be a far better source.
Great. Thank you for that. We have another question. One of our audience members, Michael from Alabama, is going to come on. Michael, how you doing? You're on mute right at the moment. There you go.
I am. I'm good. Thank you all for having this. It's been very informative. Dr. Rini, good seeing you. He's my doctor, by the way.
He's my patient.
Is it okay to tell an oncologist while I'm on stable treatment that I'm considering a clinical trial that's my next choice? I guess what I'm trying to say is it ever too early to begin discussing that as the next option with your oncologist?
I don't think it's too early. It's just, I think, as we mentioned to the other patient question, we don't know if that decision's in 2 months or 2 years, so you can think and talk and say, well, here's what's out there, but you can't really act on it until a patient's ready to move on to the next treatment. So that's just an inherent limitation. It's never, I'm always thinking about next treatments for patients and options, and sort of have a mental list, but that list may change, right? Depending on side effects, depending on timing, depending on, I don't know, a number of factors. Patients' ability and willingness to travel changes over time. So there's a number of factors. So I think, in practical terms, it's hard to do.
Great. Michael, any follow-up?
No, I'll see you in a few weeks, Dr. Rini.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Thanks
you
so
all.
much. Thank you. Well, we have about 8 to 10 minutes left here, and we've got a few that have come through the chat and some others. So let me see if I can bounce these off of you. And first one was from Mike in Minnesota. I've been a great Ipi-Nivo responder, now off treatment for 8 months. If I recur, are there active trials that might be of interest?
Yes.
Putting you on the spot.
Yeah. I hope you don't recur. I think that's great. Congratulations, first of all, on achieving that response. And again, there are trials for everyone, right? In theory, in terms of state of disease, there's nothing specific that would rule you out for a clinical trial, except a health condition that would make a study drug unsafe. Certain lines of therapy sometimes put limitations on, but in general, at every stage, trials are possible, and you should ask.
Great. Another one came in. Is it okay to tell my oncologist now while I'm stable on treatment, quote, I'd be interested in considering a trial as my next choice, and would you be able to find me those options?
Yeah, I think that was Michael's question.
Yeah.
It's certainly okay to say it. Practically, though, it's hard to know what to do about it.
But we love knowing our patients' interests. The more we know about a patient and their values and their interests, the better we can kind of long-term develop a relationship and help them. So I think if it's something you're excited about, letting your oncologist know absolutely makes sense.
I think what's helpful is not quite the question, but I have a new patient who comes in who's 3.5 hours away, and I think that could be challenging on every 3 weeks, or they're 5 hours away or something. And sometimes patients will just say, hey doc, we'll drive here as often as you want. We'll come every week. They sort of just put themselves out there and say, do not let that be a limitation, because frankly, it can be, and that's totally understandable. Patients can't travel that far. So it does potentially change my mindset a little bit. And I say, okay, I live 10 minutes away. So if you're willing to drive 5 hours, let's go, So if you do have the resources and the ability and the time to do that, sometimes just stating it is helpful.
Got it. I think we're going to just keep going through a couple more questions here. I'm showing minor growth on my current treatment. Is this a good time for me to explore possible trial options? How would I go about that? I think sort of touched on that, but if you want to give it is that a good time to explore?
I think it's a little different. The question of I'm doing totally well on treatment and stable versus, gee, my last scan was a little worse, and my oncologist said, no, let's give it one more scan. That's a little closer to the next decision point. So I think when you're, certainly at the decision point, or if you will, a scan away, that's probably a little more realistic than, the patient who said you have had a response to ipi-nivo and been off, well, hopefully you'll never need another treatment, or it's months to years in the future. I mean, it's hard to really speculate around that.
But sometimes your doctor can say, there's a little bit of growth. I don't think it's enough to change your treatment now, but next time we may want to. That's sort of foreshadowing an inflection point, which would be a good point in time to explore treatment options, both standard of care and clinical trials. So you can prepare yourself for that in a particular situation.
Great. I got two more questions right off the bat here. One is, can you define what a randomized arm is? And just because you're randomized, what does that mean vis-a-vis standard of care?
That's a great question. I'll take that. I'm pretty passionate about randomization in clinical trials. First of all, I think it should only really be used when both arms are good treatments for the patient. I think we try at our center not to open trials that randomize to an arm that we don't think is good enough, especially if we have another option off study that's better. So in that sense, a randomization, you do give up control. The doctor doesn't have control, the patient doesn't have control. You are informed of what the two different arms could be. Sometimes you know which one you're on, and sometimes if it's a placebo-controlled trial, you don't. The reason to randomize is, for instance, the recent trial of pembrolizumab in adjuvant kidney cancer, looking to see if we can cure more people by giving pembro after their cancer is removed. That study was randomized to observation or placebo, Brian? Placebo. So patients were enrolled and they said, you're going to get an infusion every 3 weeks. You may get the drug or you may get a placebo. And the reason people were comfortable with that is because off of the trial, you would have observation, you wouldn't have any treatment. And so it was felt that there was really no detriment. You're not withholding a treatment from a patient. But it does require a certain courage and commitment from the patient, right? To be willing to be in a trial when maybe they're getting a saline infusion. I'm a proponent that those trials should be randomized to observation. I think the endpoints are firm enough. We don't need a placebo, but one could argue me and people have, so that's fair. But randomization is just that you're randomized, usually 50-50, sometimes different percentages, to get one treatment over another. And that's to allow, on a study basis, on a population basis, the researchers to compare two different groups of patients to see if on the whole, the new treatment is better than the standard.
Great. Well, we're getting down to the last 4 minutes and we're getting bombarded with questions. Let me ask a quick one. When will new options be compared to each other versus everything being compared to Sutent, which I think is
now
Cosmic had ipi-nivo as a control arm, so Sutent won't be the control arm of any trials moving forward.
But that's a good point. I think it was for too long, little too long. But yeah, we're done.
Okay. Quick, any thoughts on belzutifan?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a cousin of Sutent and cabozantinib and the like. It's a HIF inhibitor. It sort of acts in a different place, but it appears to be active, meaning it shrinks tumors. It's very well tolerated. And there's a big trial that may lead to FDA approval, and actually at least a few other trials where it's being incorporated into earlier lines of therapy with other drugs. So I think if we're sitting here and, I don't know, call it a year or two, I'd be surprised if it wasn't approved for kidney cancer. It is approved in VHL syndrome, inherited kidney cancer, but not non-inherited kidney cancer yet.
Yeah, so one update on belzutifan, it was added to the NCCN guidelines, which we use, I guess, not so much in Europe. I don't know about Canada, but we use in the United States. It was added as an option. And so for patients with clear cell kidney cancer, there is good single arm data to show efficacy. And for patients who have been through most other treatments, I've actually been able to get it approved by insurance because it is FDA approved for VHL syndrome. That means it's commercially available, it's being made, and so it's accessible. It's just a matter of getting your insurance to approve it. So we used it a lot in clinical trials. I really like it. I think people feel pretty good on it. It is different in terms of side effects. It's completely different from Cabo and Sutent and Votrient. But it's, something that will be more broadly an option once it's FDA approved, but is actually a guideline endorsed treatment now.
Great. Two quick ones. Hopefully, if a patient is on a clinical trial for adjuvant therapy or is on adjuvant therapy, does it prevent them from being able to access certain systemic treatments going forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what we don't really know is that if a patient gets pembrolizumab in the adjuvant setting, how is it going to affect their response to other drugs should they recur? That's an unknown right now. It may or may not affect trial participation. It depends how the trial is written. So some frontline trials would say you cannot have received adjuvant pembrolizumab. Others might be silent on it. Others may say you can get it, but it has to be at least a year ago. So they're being written all sorts of different ways for all sorts of different reasons. So I guess the answer is a solid maybe.
Yeah, one other thing, adjuvant therapy, if you have a really severe immune reaction to immunotherapy in that setting, it may not be felt to be safe to give you more immunotherapy in the unfortunate event that your cancer recurs either on or after adjuvant therapy. So that's another possibility. Of course, it's worth it if the adjuvant therapy can potentially cure you when you wouldn't otherwise be cured. But that might be a drawback if we learn that adjuvant therapy doesn't improve survival.
Final question. You got 30 seconds each. You don't have to give the NCT number, but if there were some trials that you're looking at over the horizon and keeping an eye out, would you give us some hints of what to keep a look for?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. I mean, Merck has another big frontline triplet trial. So we were talking about 3 drugs versus 2. That's a big question in kidney cancer. And the other category of trials is sequential immune therapy. So for patients who've been on one immune therapy, is a second immune therapy helpful? We don't really know the answer to that. So in broad categories, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. I would just add to that the belzutifan drug we're talking about is entering an adjuvant trial. So it's pembrolizumab plus belzutifan versus pembrolizumab. Again, we hope adding 2 active drugs together will give better results than one. We're not sure, and that's why we're doing the trial.
Great. Well, Dr. Rini, Dr. Plimack, we've run out of time. Thank you so much. Folks who are still listening in, we have a polling question if you wouldn't mind answering for us. Want to thank everybody for taking time out of their day to listen to these 2 experts. So it's always informative, always learning something new. Thank you, Dr. Rini, Dr. Plimack. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules.
This was
Sure,
great.
happy to be
Thanks to
here.
all the great questions.
Great, thank you. And thank you to our sponsors out there, BMS, CRISPR, ASI, Exelixis, Genentech, and Merck. Thank you. Couldn't have done it without you. And if you'd like to rewatch this town hall or share it with family and friends, it'll be available on YouTube by the end of the week. And our 2023 town hall series will begin next January when it's nice and cool. And we encourage anybody out there who wants to advocate for us. District Days is August 8th and 9th. You could register and have your voice heard on Capitol Hill. And we invite you to join us immediately following this at the KidneyCAN Community Social event. The link should be in the chat. You can join us and click over there and talk to some of your fellow friends in the community. So on that note, thank you everybody. Thank you, Dr. Rini. Thank you, Dr. Plimack. Thanks, folks, for listening in.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thanks, Brian and Brian.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you for taking time today.